They valued him at nothing. That's what the ledger said when Elijah Freeman turned 42 in March of 1847. Property value, depreciated to zero, maintained only through debt obligation. 42 years breathing, 37 of them in service to the Vanderberg family of Manhattan, and the ink in their account books reduced him to a line item marked negligible asset, retained. 3 weeks later, those same hands that were worth nothing signed documents that would unravel 4 of the most powerful families on the eastern seaboard. But nobody knew that yet, especially not Elijah. The morning Sarah disappeared, the sky over New York Harbor was the color of old bruises. Elijah had been awake since 4, as always, preparing Master Vanderberg's breakfast in the townhouse kitchen on Washington Square. His hands moved through the familiar routine: coffee measured precisely, eggs beaten exactly 47 strokes, toast cut at perfect diagonals. 17 years as head of household staff had trained his body to perform these tasks, while his mind worked elsewhere. Lately, his mind worked on numbers, always numbers. He knew, for instance, that Master Vanderberg had lost $42,000 in bad railroad investments over the past 6 months. He knew because he'd served brandy during 14 separate meetings where men with nervous voices discussed the matter in increasingly desperate tones. He knew that Mrs. Vanderberg spent $117 monthly on a Chelsea apartment she believed her husband didn't know about. But Elijah knew because he'd seen the lease agreement left carelessly on the study desk. He knew that the eldest Vanderberg son, Theodore, owed $6,000 to gambling establishments his father would kill him for patronizing. Elijah knew everything. That was the problem with being invisible. People forgot you had ears. "Freeman!" The voice cut through the kitchen's morning silence. Davis, the Vanderbergs' business manager, stood in the doorway with an expression that made Elijah's hands still over the egg pan. Davis never came to the kitchen. "Your daughter. There's been a change in arrangements." The eggs continued cooking. Elijah heard them sizzle, heard Davis clear his throat, heard his own heartbeat suddenly loud in his ears. Sarah was 16. She worked in the Vanderberg household too, had since she was 12 after her mother died of cholera. Arrangements. The word sat in Elijah's stomach like spoiled meat. What arrangements? His voice came out steady. 42 years had taught him how to keep his voice steady. "She's being transferred to the Whitmore family, Charleston. They're kin to the Vanderbergs, you understand. Business settlement. She leaves this afternoon." The eggs burned. Elijah smelled them burning but couldn't move. Charleston, South Carolina, where slavery wasn't a legal fiction wrapped in debt contracts, but an iron reality from which there was no emergence. New York had abolished slavery 20 years ago, technically, but men like Vanderberg had found ways around abolition: debt bondage, apprenticeship contracts that lasted lifetimes, legal tangles that kept people trapped in everything but name. Sarah was free on paper. They all were, technically, but paper meant nothing when men like Vanderberg held the pen. "She's my daughter." The words sounded stupid even as Elijah said them, as if that mattered, as if that had ever mattered. Davis shifted his weight, uncomfortable. He was young, maybe 25, new to the Vanderberg employ. He hadn't yet learned to look straight through the enslaved as if they were furniture. "It's already decided. Master Vanderberg himself arranged it. Payment on a debt. You understand how these things work." Elijah understood exactly how these things worked. He understood that Sarah, young and healthy and beautiful in a way that made him terrified every day she lived in this house, was worth more than her labor. Worth more as a body than as a person. He understood that the Whitmore family of Charleston didn't need kitchen help. They needed something else entirely. The pan clattered when he dropped it. Hot eggs splattered across the brick floor. Davis stepped back, startled, and for a moment Elijah saw something in the younger man's face. Recognition, maybe, that he'd just destroyed someone's world before breakfast. "You can't take her." Elijah's voice wasn't steady anymore. "It's done. The papers are signed. She's free. The state made her free. The state also acknowledges debt obligation. Your daughter is bound to Vanderberg service until age 21 through your unpaid debts. Those debts can be transferred. Have been transferred." Davis pulled a document from his jacket. "It's legal. I verified it myself." Elijah had debts. Everyone did. The enslaved paid rent for their rooms, paid for their food, paid for clothes and medical care, paid interest on money borrowed for their own funerals someday. The math never worked out. It was designed, never to work out. Elijah's debt to the Vanderberg family currently stood at $843.16. He knew the exact number because he'd memorized the ledger the last time he'd cleaned Master Vanderberg's study. $843. The price of his daughter's freedom. Might as well have been $843,000. He found Sarah in the laundry room, folding sheets with 2 other house servants. She looked up when he entered, and he watched her face cycle through confusion, to fear, to understanding. She'd always been quick, his Sarah. Had her mother's intelligence, her mother's fierce eyes. She'd taught herself to read by watching Elijah practice the letters he'd learned secretly, as a boy from a tutor, who'd believed in abolition more than he'd believed in keeping his employment. Papa. Her voice was small. She knew. Somehow she already knew. The other servants found reasons to leave. Suddenly it was just Elijah and Sarah in a room that smelled of lye and lavender, and he had to tell his daughter that she was being sold to a family in Charleston because her body was worth more than her freedom. He couldn't say it. The words stuck in his throat like broken glass. When? Sarah asked instead. This afternoon. They said this afternoon. She nodded slowly, set down the sheet she'd been folding. Her hands were shaking, but she folded them carefully in her lap, the way he'd taught her when she was small. Keep your hands still. Never let them see you shake. Never give them that satisfaction. Then we don't have time to run, she said quietly. No, the Underground Railroad existed, theoretically. Elijah knew people who could help. But it took time to arrange, took planning, took resources they didn't have. And if they tried and failed, if they were caught, it wouldn't be Charleston. It would be somewhere worse. There were places worse than Charleston. Papa, Sarah looked at him with her mother's eyes. Promise me you won't do anything stupid. He promised. It was a lie, and she knew it was a lie. But she let him say it anyway because sometimes lies were the only kindness left. They came for her at 3 o'clock. 2 men Elijah had never seen before, hired transporters with hard faces and harder hands. Master Vanderberg himself supervised from the front parlor, looking vaguely uncomfortable but determined. This was business. Just business. Nothing personal. Elijah tried to stop them at the door. He didn't mean to. His body moved before his mind could stop it. He grabbed Sarah's arm, pulled her back, and said something he didn't remember later. Something desperate and useless. Master Vanderberg nodded to the transporters. Elijah remembered a fist, remembered his face hitting marble, remembered Sarah screaming, remembered being dragged to the cellar and locked in while they took his daughter away. He heard the carriage leave, heard the horses' hooves on cobblestone, heard them fade into the distance of Manhattan's late afternoon traffic, heard them disappear entirely. When they finally let him out 3 hours later, Davis was waiting with a cold compress and an expression that might have been sympathy, if sympathy were permitted between the employed and the enslaved. Master Vanderberg says if you cause further disruption, your debt will be transferred too, somewhere less pleasant than here. He says you should be grateful he's keeping you in New York. Elijah took the compress, said nothing. Grateful. He was supposed to be grateful. That night, lying in his small room in the servants' quarters, Elijah's mind began to work the way it always worked, calculating, measuring, counting. But this time, he wasn't counting Master Vanderberg's losses, or Mrs. Vanderberg's expenses, or young Theodore's debts. He was counting everything he knew. Every secret, every lie, every illegal transaction, every hidden mistress, every fraudulent business deal, every bribed politician, every document he'd seen left carelessly on desks by men who thought he couldn't read. Elijah Freeman had spent 37 years being invisible, being furniture, being the trusted servant who stood silent in corners while Manhattan's wealthiest families discussed their sins over dinner. They'd trusted him because he was nothing, worth nothing. A line item in a ledger marked negligible, but nothing accumulated power like being nothing, because nothing saw everything. The Vanderbergs held 4 dinner parties monthly, always on Thursdays. They invited the same families in rotation: the Ashfords, who owned 3 banks and 2 shipping companies; the Kensingtons, whose textile mills employed half of Lower Manhattan; the Whitmores, who maintained business interests spanning from New York to Charleston to Liverpool. 4 families. 4 empires built on money so old and so tangled that even their lawyers couldn't track it all. But Elijah could track it. He'd been tracking it for years without meaning to, the way some men collected stamps or butterflies. He collected information because information was the only thing they couldn't take from him. Knowledge was the only property he truly owned. He owned, for instance, the knowledge that Archibald Ashford had fathered 3 children with his wife's sister. The children were being raised in Philadelphia, funded through an account Ashford thought was secret. Elijah had seen the bank statements. He owned the knowledge that Jonathan Kensington's textile mills hadn't paid federal taxes in 4 years, that the books were cooked by a nervous accountant who drank too much at dinner parties and talked to himself. Elijah had listened. He owned the knowledge that the Whitmores, both the New York and Charleston branches, were involved in something that went beyond regular business, something involving ships that left Charleston in the middle of the night, something that smelled like the illegal slave trade everyone pretended had ended decades ago. Elijah had heard enough whispered conversations to understand that some rules only applied to some people. And he owned, most dangerously, the knowledge that Master Vanderberg himself had embezzled $47,000 from his own company over the past 2 years. The money was hidden in an account under a false name. Elijah had cleaned the study, had seen the account book in the same hidden drawer where Vanderberg kept his laudanum and his mistress's love letters. 4 families, 4 disasters waiting to happen. All it needed was someone to light the match. But Elijah wasn't thinking about destruction yet. Not in those first days after Sarah left. He was thinking about salvation, about $843.16, about finding his daughter before Charleston swallowed her whole. He began carefully. Started by talking to people in the small community of freedmen and women who gathered at the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church on Sunday mornings. There was a network, whispered about, but never explicitly named. People who helped other people disappear. People who knew people in Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston. People who could get messages south sometimes if you knew who to ask and how to pay. Elijah asked. Used the tiny salary Vanderberg paid him, $3 monthly, a joke compared to what white servants earned, but something. He saved every cent, stopped buying the tobacco he'd allowed himself on Saturdays, stopped everything that wasn't absolutely necessary. $3 a month. He needed $1,200 to buy Sarah's freedom, if he could find who owned her now, or $300 to pay someone to help her escape if she were willing to risk the run north. The math was impossible. At $3 monthly, it would take 33 years to save $1,200. Sarah would be 49 years old if she lived that long. So Elijah began stealing, just pennies at first. Coins that fell behind furniture during parties, bills left in pockets of coats he was trusted to hang, small amounts from petty cash boxes that Master Vanderberg would never notice missing. $5 the first month, $8 the second. By the 4th month, he'd accumulated $37 and change, hidden in a hollow brick behind the kitchen stove. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But he kept saving anyway, because stopping meant admitting Sarah was gone forever. The letter arrived in July, 4 months after Sarah had been taken. A freedman named Marcus, who worked on the docks and had connections Elijah didn't ask about, brought it to him after Sunday service. The envelope was water-stained and had been opened, read, resealed badly. Privacy was another luxury of the free. Inside, 6 words in careful handwriting that Elijah recognized. Sarah had been practicing letters with him since she was small. Papa, Natchez, dying, please come. Sarah, Natchez, Mississippi, 800 miles south, dying. Elijah's hands didn't shake when he read it. 42 years had trained his hands not to shake, but something inside his chest cracked clean through, something that would never heal right even if he lived 100 years. Marcus watched him with sympathy that was worse than pity. I asked around. She was sold twice after Charleston, ended up on a cotton plantation near Natchez. Yellow fever went through the area this spring. She survived it, but he trailed off because what else was there to say? Surviving yellow fever didn't mean thriving. It meant you lived long enough to die more slowly. How much to get her out? Elijah's voice sounded distant to his own ears. Depends. You buying her or stealing her? Buying. Stealing required strength and numbers and luck. Elijah had information, but information didn't stop bullets. Marcus shook his head slowly. Young woman? Even sick? $1,200 minimum. Maybe more if they're cruel about it. $1,200. Elijah had $37 hidden behind a brick. He'd die before he saved $1,200. Sarah would die before he saved $1,200. There might be another way, Marcus said carefully. There's folks who do quick extractions. Dangerous as hell, but faster than buying. Cost you $300, maybe $400. But it only works if she can travel. If she's too sick, how long would it take to arrange it? 2 months, maybe 3. Need to coordinate with people down there, wait for the right moment, get her to Memphis or St. Louis where they can smuggle her north on a steamboat. 2 months. Sarah might not have 2 months, but Elijah didn't have $1,200. He had choices that weren't really choices at all. I need $400, he said. Can you get it? Elijah thought about the $37 behind the brick, thought about Master Vanderberg's petty cash box, thought about Mrs. Vanderberg's jewelry, Theodore's gold watch, all the small valuables in a house full of wealth built on the backs of people who owned nothing. Yes, he lied, I can get it. Marcus studied him for a long moment. Don't do anything that'll get you killed before we can help your girl. Dead fathers don't pay rescue fees. I'll be careful. Another lie. Elijah was done being careful. Careful had gotten him 42 years of slavery wrapped in legal fiction. Careful had gotten his daughter sold to Charleston, then sold again to Natchez, then dying slowly in a place he couldn't reach. Careful had gotten him exactly nowhere. That night, Elijah sat in his small room and began making lists. Not lists on paper, he couldn't risk anything being found, but lists in his mind, where he kept everything that mattered. List 1. Everything he knew about the Vanderbergs. Every illegal transaction, every hidden account, every secret that would destroy them if it became public. List 2. Everything he knew about the Ashfords, the illegitimate children, the fraud, the business deals that skirted the edge of criminality. List 3. The Kensingtons, tax evasion, workplace deaths covered up, contracts with companies everyone knew were fronts for something worse. List 4. The Whitmores, the ships in the night, the money moving through channels that smelled like human cargo, the connection to Charleston families who definitely still trafficked in flesh despite federal laws. 4 families, 4 pillars holding up Manhattan's elite society. 4 structures that would collapse if someone kicked out the right support beam. Elijah didn't want to destroy them. Destruction was pointless, just chaos that would satisfy nothing. He wanted his daughter. That's all he'd ever wanted. Just Sarah, safe, alive, free in a way that meant something beyond paperwork. But as summer turned toward fall and his secret savings crept toward $100, nowhere near enough, never enough, Elijah began to understand something that sat bitter in his mouth. He couldn't save her. Not with money, not with patience, not with careful planning. The math didn't work. It would never work. The system was designed to make the math impossible, but he could make them pay. That math worked perfectly. September brought cooler air and another letter from Marcus. Sarah was alive but weaker. The people in Natchez said she needed to move soon if she was going to move at all. They needed $200 immediately to start making arrangements. The rest could come later. Elijah gave Marcus everything behind the brick, $117.42. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. I'll get the rest, he promised, whatever it takes. Marcus looked worried. Elijah, brother, I know what you're thinking. Don't. They'll hang you for it. They'll hang me for being born black in the wrong century. Might as well hang for something worthwhile. It wasn't quite a joke, but Marcus laughed anyway because sometimes gallows humor was the only kind left. Elijah began taking bigger risks. A silver candlestick from the Vanderberg dining room, pawned to a fence in 5 points. Who asked no questions. $15. Mrs. Vanderberg's emerald earrings from her jewelry box. She had so many, surely she wouldn't notice one pair missing. $40. Master Vanderberg's gold cufflinks. $22. He was careful about timing, about spacing the thefts, about taking things that might be legitimately lost rather than obviously stolen. But he knew it couldn't last. Eventually someone would notice. Eventually there would be an accounting. Eventually came in November. Master Vanderberg called him to the study on a Thursday evening, after the regular dinner party. The Ashfords and Kensingtons had just left. The room still smelled of cigar smoke and brandy. Freeman, we have a problem. Vanderberg's voice was cold. He stood behind his desk like a judge delivering sentence. Items have gone missing from this household. Valuable items. Do you know anything about this? Elijah kept his face carefully neutral. No, sir. No. How interesting. Because you're the only person with access to all areas of this house. You're the head of staff. Nothing moves here without your knowledge. Perhaps one of the other servants... Don't. Vanderberg's voice cracked like a whip. Don't insult my intelligence by suggesting someone else. It's you. We both know it's you. The only question is whether you're smart enough to confess and beg forgiveness, or stupid enough to keep lying. Elijah said nothing. 42 years had taught him when silence was the only safe response. Vanderberg sighed, suddenly tired. I've been generous with you, Freeman. Kept you in New York when I could have sent you south with your daughter. Given you a position of trust. This is how you repay that trust? Generous. The word burned. Elijah felt something hot and black rising in his chest, something that had been building since March, since the day they took Sarah, since every day of his 42 years of breathing air that belonged to someone else. My daughter is dying in Mississippi. His voice came out steady despite the rage. Dying because you sold her to pay a debt that wasn't hers. You call that generous? Vanderberg's face hardened. Your daughter was transferred to settle a legitimate business obligation. That's how the world works. Surely you're not so naive as to think otherwise. She's 16 years old. She's property, Freeman. Or have you forgotten how this works? You're both free on paper, but paper means nothing next to debt. Your debt, which you've been stealing to pay off, apparently. Stealing. Elijah laughed, and it came out wrong, harsh and bitter. You steal my life, my daughter's life, 42 years of breathing, and you call it business. I take a few coins to save my daughter's life, and you call it theft. You want to talk about theft, Master Vanderberg? Let's talk about theft. He said it without thinking. Said it because the pressure in his chest needed an outlet or he'd explode. But the moment the words left his mouth, he saw Vanderberg's expression change, saw calculation replace anger. Careful, Freeman. You're angry, and angry men say things that get them killed. Elijah should have stopped, should have apologized, should have begged forgiveness, should have fallen back into the role of obedient servant who knew his place. Instead, he heard himself say, $47,000. Silence. Vanderberg went very still. I don't know what you're talking about. The account under the name James Wilson, Baltimore Trust Bank. $47,132 as of last month. Embezzled from your own company over 2 years. Want me to keep going? The color drained from Vanderberg's face. How do you... I clean your study, sir. Every day for 17 years. You leave documents on your desk. Sometimes in drawers that aren't locked as well as you think. You have conversations with business partners who forget I have ears. I know everything, Master Vanderberg, everything about you. Everything about the Ashfords, the Kensingtons, the Whitmores. Everything. It was stupid. It was suicidal. It was 42 years of rage spilling out in one reckless moment. But God, it felt good to finally say it out loud. Vanderberg moved fast for a man his age. He was across the study in 3 strides, had Elijah by the throat, slammed him against the wall hard enough that paintings rattled. You threaten me? You dare threaten me in my own home? Elijah couldn't breathe, but he smiled anyway. Smiled because for the first time in his life, he'd seen fear in a master's eyes. Real fear. The fear of a man who suddenly realized the furniture had teeth. Not threatening, he gasped, just talking. About theft. Like you wanted. Vanderberg's grip tightened. Black spots danced across Elijah's vision. For a moment he thought this was it. Thought Vanderberg would kill him right here, and maybe that was fine. Maybe Sarah dying in Natchez and him dying in New York was just how this story ended. But Vanderberg let go. Stepped back. His hands were shaking. Get out, he said quietly. Get out of my house tonight. I don't care where you go. You're fired. Your debt is void. You're free. Now get out before I change my mind and have you hanged for theft. Elijah rubbed his throat. My debt? I said it's void. Consider it payment for your silence. Because if anything you claim to know becomes public, if any rumors start circulating, I'll know exactly where they came from. And I'll make sure you hang for it. Do we understand each other? They understood each other perfectly. Elijah had just destroyed his own life to save it. He was free, legally, actually free, no more debt. But he had nothing. No job, no home, no money, no way to save Sarah. He'd gained his freedom and lost everything that mattered. Elijah gathered his few belongings that night and left the Vanderberg townhouse for the last time. Walked out into November cold with everything he owned in a canvas sack. 3 changes of clothes, his mother's Bible, $43 stolen from petty cash on his way out, and a head full of secrets that could destroy 4 families. He had no idea what to do with any of it. The African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church on Leonard Street became Elijah's refuge that first week. Reverend Morris, who'd known Elijah for years, offered him space in the small room behind the church, where visiting clergy sometimes stayed. It wasn't much: a cot, a basin, a single window that looked out on an alley, but it was more than Elijah had expected to have. "What happened?" Reverend Morris asked that first night, bringing weak tea and bread. "Got free." Elijah's voice was hollow. "Finally got free." The Reverend heard what wasn't being said. "And your daughter? Still dying in Mississippi? Still needs $400 I don't have." Reverend Morris sat heavily in the room's only chair. He was 60-something, gray-haired, with hands scarred from years working in tanneries, before he'd bought his own freedom and found God. Or maybe God had found him. Freedom's a strange thing, isn't it? Fought for it my whole life. Got it. Then discovered freedom don't pay rent or put food on tables or save daughters from dying 800 miles south. "No," Elijah agreed. "It doesn't." "What will you do?" Elijah had been asking himself the same question for 3 days. He had $43. He needed $400, and that was just for the extraction. Didn't include bribes, travel expenses, medical care Sarah would need once they got her north. The real number was probably 600. Might as well be 6 million. "I don't know," he admitted, but that was a lie. He knew exactly what he was going to do, had known since the moment Vanderberg's hands closed around his throat, and he'd seen fear in a master's eyes. Had known since he'd walked out of that townhouse with nothing but secrets and rage and a freedom that tasted like ash. He was going to burn them down. All of them. The Vanderbergs, the Ashfords, the Kensingtons, the Whitmores. Every family that had built empires on the backs of people they considered furniture. He was going to burn them down and salt the earth where their houses stood. Not for justice. Justice was a luxury Elijah couldn't afford. He was going to do it because destruction was the only currency he had left. "I need paper," he said quietly. "And ink. Can you get me paper and ink?" Reverend Morris studied him for a long moment. "What are you planning, Elijah?" "Writing letters." "To who?" "Everyone who needs to know the truth." The Reverend didn't ask what truth, didn't ask why. Just nodded slowly. "There's writing supplies in my office. Help yourself. But Elijah, be careful. Men have been hanged for less than what you're thinking." "Men get hanged for being born," Elijah replied. "At least let me earn it." The first letter took him 3 days to write. Not because he didn't know what to say. He'd been composing it in his head for weeks, but because his writing was slow and laborious. He'd learned his letters as a child, practiced in secret for years, but formal writing still came hard. Each word had to be carefully formed, each sentence checked and rechecked for mistakes that might give away his lack of education. The letter was addressed to Mrs. Victoria Ashford, wife of Archibald Ashford, owner of 3 banks and 2 shipping companies. It was short, direct, and devastating. "Dear Mrs. Ashford, your husband maintains a second household in Philadelphia. The address is 1847 Chestnut Street. The woman's name is Margaret Ashford. She uses your name, did you know? Your sister, Margaret, to be precise. They have 3 children, James age 14, William age 12, Elizabeth age 9. Bank records show monthly payments of $200 from the Continental Bank of New York, account number 7294. Your husband visits every 3rd Sunday. He told you he was inspecting the Philadelphia shipping office. He lied. A concerned party who knows the truth. Elijah read it over 20 times, changed words, simplified phrases, made sure it sounded educated enough to be taken seriously, but not so educated that it seemed fake. The facts were devastating enough. They didn't need embellishment. He didn't sign it, didn't put a return address, just sealed it and paid a street boy 2 cents to post it from a box across town. Untraceable. The second letter went to the New York Herald, one of the abolitionist newspapers that printed stories about corruption and moral decay in the city's elite families. This one was longer, more detailed. To the editor, "I write to inform you of a matter of public interest regarding tax evasion by the Kensington Textile Company. Over the past 4 years, Mr. Jonathan Kensington has failed to report accurate income to federal authorities, hiding profits through a series of shell companies based in Boston and Baltimore. Documentation can be found in the offices of Whitmore and Associates, where Mr. Kensington's accountant, a Mr. Charles Webb, maintains records. Mr. Webb has expressed concern about these practices, but fears for his employment." Additionally, workplace accidents at Kensington Mills have been systematically underreported to avoid federal oversight. At least 17 deaths in the past 2 years were classified as natural causes or outside accidents, despite occurring on mill property during working hours. A worker who has witnessed these injustices, the third letter was the most dangerous. It went to the Federal Marshal's office and detailed the Whitmore family's involvement in illegal slave trading. This one Elijah wrote 3 times, each version more careful than the last, because accusing wealthy white men of federal crimes required evidence that couldn't be easily dismissed. To the Federal Marshal of New York, this letter concerns violations of the Act Prohibiting Importation of Slaves, 1808, by members of the Whitmore family, both New York and Charleston branches. Ships owned by Whitmore Shipping have been used to transport human cargo from Cuba to Charleston on at least 6 occasions in the past 18 months. The ships in question are the Caroline, departed November 1850, February 1851, July 1851. The James Madison, departed April 1851, September 1851, and the Liberty, departed December 1850. Records of these voyages are kept in the Charleston office. Bills of lading list agricultural equipment, but harbor records show no such cargo loaded or unloaded. Witnesses in Charleston include dock workers Henry Fraser and Thomas Moore. A citizen who believes in the law, Elijah didn't know if Henry Fraser and Thomas Moore actually existed. He'd made up the names, gambling that the marshal's office would investigate anyway if the other details checked out. And he knew the other details were accurate, because he'd listened to 2 years of whispered conversations between the Whitmore cousins during Thursday night dinners at the Vanderberg house. Rich men got drunk and talked. Enslaved servants became invisible. Invisible people heard everything. The 4th letter was personal. It went to Master Vanderberg himself, but not to expose him, not yet. This one was crueler. Dear Mr. Vanderberg, your wife knows about the apartment on Bleecker Street. She knows about Miss Catherine Holland. She knows you've spent $2,300 on that woman in the past year. She knows because I told her. I thought you should know that I told her. The same person who will tell everyone else what you've done. P.S. The account in Baltimore has been reported to your business partners. He didn't send that last one immediately. Kept it in his coat pocket like a loaded weapon, waiting for the right moment, because timing mattered. Chaos had to cascade carefully if it was going to achieve maximum destruction. Marcus found him at the church 2 weeks after the first letters went out. He looked worried, which was never a good sign. Your girl. He said it without preamble, the way you delivered bad news when there was no gentle way to do it. She's worse. The people in Natchez say she's got maybe a month, 2 if she's lucky and gets good care, which she won't. Elijah's hands didn't shake. He'd trained them too well for that, but something in his chest constricted, squeezed until he couldn't breathe right. How much do they need? 300 now. Another 2 when they get her to Memphis. But Elijah, she might not survive the journey. They're saying she's too weak to travel. If we try to move her and she dies on the road, she dies anyway if she stays. His voice came out flat. At least on the road she has a chance. Do you have $300? Elijah had $41 left. He'd spent 2 on posting letters and street boys to carry them. Not yet. When? Soon. Marcus looked at him with an expression that was part pity, part fear. What are you doing, brother? People are talking. Strange things happening in the city. The Ashfords had some kind of family crisis. Wife threw the husband out, huge scandal. Federal marshals showed up at the Whitmore offices asking questions about ships. Word is the Kensingtons are being audited, and there's rumors about Vanderberg, something about embezzlement. All of this in 2 weeks. That's a lot of coincidence. Life's full of coincidences. Don't. Marcus's voice was sharp. Don't play games with me. I know what you're doing. I know why. But you need to understand these men have power. Real power. They can have you killed and call it legal. They can make you disappear, and no one will ask questions. Is revenge worth your life? It's not revenge. Elijah met Marcus's eyes. It's currency. I'm destroying them because destruction is the only thing I can afford to do, because maybe somewhere in the chaos there'll be money or opportunity or something I can use to save my daughter. That's all this is, transaction. That's insane. Yes, Elijah agreed. It probably is. Marcus left, shaking his head. But 3 days later he came back with news that made Elijah's calculated gamble look less insane. The Ashford banks are in trouble. Big trouble. Mrs. Ashford hired lawyers. They started looking into her husband's finances, found irregularities. Now there's a run on Continental Bank, people pulling their money out because they think Ashford's been stealing from depositors. Bank's going to collapse. They're saying Ashford might lose everything. Elijah absorbed this information carefully. When does the bank close? End of the month, maybe. Why? Because bank employees who are about to lose their jobs talk. And sometimes they take things that aren't nailed down on their way out. Marcus stared at him. You're thinking about robbing a failing bank? I'm thinking about being in the right place when chaos creates opportunity. It was insane. But insanity was just strategy that hadn't succeeded yet. Elijah spent the next week watching the Continental Bank building on Wall Street. Watched the patterns of employees coming and going. Watched which doors were guarded and which weren't. Watched where the money was kept and who had keys. He didn't look like a threat. That was his advantage. 42 years of being invisible had taught him how to stand on a street corner without being seen, how to fade into the background like furniture, how to be so unremarkable that people's eyes slid right past him. On December 3rd, the bank officially announced it was closing. Depositors panicked. There was a run, hundreds of people demanding their money, pushing against doors, shouting at clerks who had no answers to give. Police showed up to control the crowd. Complete chaos. Elijah walked in through a side entrance while everyone's attention was focused on the front doors, walked past offices where clerks were frantically boxing up files, past secured areas that weren't secured anymore because the guards had quit that morning. Walked straight to the records room, where he'd watched a nervous accountant go 6 times in the past week. The accountant was there now, stuffing papers into a leather satchel. He looked up when Elijah entered, startled, then relaxed slightly. Just another black servant probably sent to help move files. No threat. What do you want? The accountant's voice was high-pitched, stressed. Mr. Ashford sent me. The lie came smooth as silk. He needs the emergency fund, the one in the back safe. There was no emergency fund that Elijah knew of, but banks always kept cash on hand for exactly this kind of crisis, and nervous men under pressure didn't think clearly. The accountant hesitated. He didn't tell me. He's dealing with the crowd out front. Wants it moved before the police start asking questions about where the money went. You want to be the one who tells him no? The accountant's face went pale. The back safe? That's what he said. 3 minutes later, Elijah walked out of the Continental Bank with $460 in a cloth bag hidden under his coat. The accountant had handed it over without asking for authorization in writing, too panicked to think straight, too worried about his own survival to question why a black man he'd never seen before was suddenly authorized to handle Ashford's emergency cash. By the time anyone discovered the money missing, the bank would be closed, and Ashford would be too busy fighting off creditors to investigate every dollar that vanished in the chaos. Elijah didn't run. Running drew attention. He walked 3 blocks at a normal pace, then 4 more, then 5, ducked into an alley, counted the money twice to be sure, and felt something he hadn't felt in 8 months. Hope. $460. More than enough for Sarah's extraction. Enough for bribes and travel and medical care. Enough to save her if there was still time. He found Marcus that evening. I have the money. Marcus looked at the cloth bag, at Elijah's face, and decided not to ask where it came from. I'll send word tonight. They'll start moving her within a week. Should have her in Memphis by Christmas, on a boat north by New Year. She'll be in New York by late January if everything goes according to plan. If. Such a small word. Such a massive gamble. Tell them to hurry, Elijah said. Please, tell them to hurry. Marcus took the money and left. Elijah stood in the church's small back room and allowed himself 30 seconds of something that felt almost like relief. Sarah would live. She had to live. He'd destroyed 4 families and stolen from a failing bank and burned every bridge he'd ever built, but she would live. 30 seconds. Then he went back to work. Because the letters weren't finished. He'd only sent 3. There were others to write. More careful bombs to plant, more fires to light. The Bergs still stood. The Kensingtons were being audited but not destroyed. The Whitmores were under investigation but still operating. Elijah had started this. He intended to finish it. The letter to Mrs. Berg went out the next day. He'd been saving it, waiting for the right moment. This was the right moment. Dear Mrs. Berg, your husband has been stealing from his own company. $47,132 in an account under the name James Wilson at Baltimore Trust Bank. He plans to leave the country when the embezzlement is discovered. He plans to leave you behind to face the consequences. Your home will be seized. You will be left with nothing. I can provide documentation if you hire a lawyer and ask the right questions. But you must act quickly. He is planning to flee in the next 2 weeks. Someone who believes you deserve better. It was cruel. Mrs. Vanderberg had never been actively terrible to Elijah, never kind, but never deliberately vicious either. She was just complicit, just passively accepting of a system that benefited her. But Elijah was done making distinctions between active cruelty and passive acceptance. They were all guilty. They would all pay. The next letter went to Vanderberg's business partners, the one after that to the bank holding his fraudulent account, then to the newspaper, then to a rival company that would benefit from Vanderberg's collapse. Elijah wrote letters for 2 weeks straight, his hand cramped, his eyes burned from checking and rechecking every word, but he kept writing because this was the only weapon he had, and he intended to use it until it was blunt and useless, or until his enemies were destroyed. By mid-December, Manhattan's elite society was imploding. Archibald Ashford filed for bankruptcy. His wife filed for divorce, taking half of nothing. His banks closed. Depositors lost fortunes. The scandal made front-page news. Jonathan Kensington was arrested for tax evasion. Federal investigators had found exactly what Elijah's letter promised they'd find. His mills were shut down pending investigation. His workers rioted when they weren't paid. The Whitmores were under federal investigation for slave trafficking. 2 of their ships were impounded in Charleston. Family members were turning on each other, each trying to avoid prosecution by blaming the others. And Vanderberg, Master Vanderberg, who'd sold Sarah to pay a debt, who'd kept Elijah in bondage for 42 years, who'd called himself generous. Vanderberg's world was falling apart slowly and publicly. His wife had indeed hired lawyers. They'd found the account in Baltimore, found the embezzlement, found the mistress, found everything. She'd filed for divorce and criminal charges simultaneously. Vanderberg's business partners had pushed him out. His company was being dissolved. His assets were being seized. He'd gone from wealthy and powerful to bankrupt and criminal in the span of a month. Elijah watched it all from the shadows, read newspaper accounts in the church's small library, heard gossip from other servants who brought stories to Sunday services, pieced together the cascading destruction like a man watching his own controlled burn spread exactly as planned. It should have felt satisfying, should have felt like justice, like retribution, like the universe finally balancing its scales. It felt empty, because Sarah was still dying 800 miles south, and all the destruction in New York couldn't change that. Christmas came and went. Elijah spent it alone in the church, eating donated food and rereading the letter from Marcus that had arrived 2 days before. They moved her, traveling slower than hoped. She's very weak. Might not make Memphis by New Year, but she's alive. She's fighting. We'll send word when she reaches the river. Alive. Fighting. Not saved yet, but not dead either. Elijah clung to those words, like a drowning man clung to driftwood. New Year's Day, 1852, brought snow and another letter. This one wasn't from Marcus. It was addressed in handwriting Elijah didn't recognize, delivered to the church by a courier who left before Reverend Morris could ask questions. Inside, a single sheet of paper with 5 words, "We know what you did." No signature, no return address, just those 5 words and the implied threat behind them. Elijah read it 3 times, then burned it in the church's stove. His hands were steady. He'd been expecting this. Had known eventually someone would connect the letters, the timing, the specific details that only an insider could know. He'd destroyed 4 families. They would want revenge. That was fine. He'd been dead his whole life anyway. What was one more death threat? 3 days later, Marcus came running to the church at midnight, pounded on the door until Reverend Morris woke up and let him in. Found Elijah in the back room and said the words that made the past 2 months worth everything. "She's in Memphis, alive. They'll have her on a boat north tomorrow. She'll be here in 2 weeks. Elijah's hands finally shook. After 42 years of training them to be steady, after 8 months of holding himself together through everything, his hands finally betrayed him and shook like leaves in a storm. 2 weeks, he repeated. 2 weeks, Marcus confirmed. You did it, brother. You actually did it. Elijah had robbed a bank and destroyed 4 families and burned his entire life to ash. He'd committed enough crimes to be hanged 10 times over. He'd become exactly the kind of dangerous criminal that justified every fear white society had about freed black men. And in 2 weeks, his daughter would be alive in New York. It was worth it. God help him, it was worth it. But the story wasn't over yet. Elijah had sent letters, lit fires, toppled empires. Now he had to survive long enough to see Sarah again, because 5 words on a paper meant someone was coming for him, and whoever they were, they wouldn't care that he'd done it all for his daughter, wouldn't care about justice or revenge or the impossible mathematics of saving someone you loved. They'd only care that he'd dared to fight back, and that was unforgivable. Elijah spent the next 2 weeks preparing for war. The war Elijah prepared for arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-January, not with violence, not yet, but with a visitor who knocked politely on the church door and asked Reverend Morris if he might speak with Mr. Freeman. The man was well-dressed, maybe 50 years old, with the kind of face that suggested he'd seen terrible things and done worse. He introduced himself as Mr. Garrett, private investigator, and he carried a leather portfolio that Elijah knew contained evidence of everything he'd done. They sat in the church's small meeting room. Reverend Morris insisted on staying, positioned by the door like a guardian who knew he couldn't actually protect anyone, but was determined to try anyway. Mr. Freeman, Garrett's voice was professionally neutral. I've been hired by several prominent families to investigate a series of unfortunate events that have befallen them recently. The Ashfords, the Kensingtons, the Whitmores, and the Bergs have all experienced significant difficulties in the past 2 months. Curious timing, wouldn't you say? Elijah said nothing. 42 years had taught him the value of silence. Garrett opened his portfolio. Anonymous letters, very specific letters containing information that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of these families' private affairs, someone who had access to homes, documents, conversations, someone like a trusted household servant, perhaps. Perhaps, Elijah agreed quietly. There are many servants in Manhattan. Indeed, but only one servant worked in the Vanderberg household for 17 years, had reason to hold a grudge after his daughter was sold to Charleston and was conveniently fired right before these letters started appearing. Garrett pulled out a sheet of paper. The handwriting analysis isn't conclusive. Whoever wrote these was careful, disguised their hand. But there are patterns, educational level matches, vocabulary matches, certain phrasings that appear in church records where you've signed your name. Reverend Morris shifted by the door. Mr. Garrett, I hope you're not accusing. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, Reverend. I'm simply presenting facts. Garrett looked at Elijah with something that might have been respect. 4 families destroyed in 2 months, millions of dollars lost, reputations ruined, all from a few pieces of paper and well-timed truths. It's almost impressive. Almost, Elijah echoed. The families want justice, of course, want someone to pay for their losses, but here's the interesting thing. Garrett leaned back in his chair. Everything in those letters was true, demonstrably, legally, publicly true. Ashford did have a second family. Kensington did evade taxes. The Whitmores were trafficking slaves. Vanderberg did embezzle. No lies, just truths told to the right people at the right time. Truth isn't a crime, Elijah said carefully. No, it isn't, but theft is. The Continental Bank is missing $460 from the day it closed. Security was chaos, records incomplete, but someone walked out with that money. Someone who needed exactly that amount to arrange an extraction from Mississippi. Garrett's eyes were sharp. Your daughter arrived in Memphis 2 weeks ago. She's on a steamboat north right now, due to arrive in New York tomorrow. That's good news, Mr. Freeman. I'm genuinely glad she's alive. Elijah's chest constricted. They knew everything. Every move, every letter, every crime. He was finished. So arrest me, he said flatly. If you have evidence, arrest me. That's the problem. Garrett closed his portfolio. I have evidence of theft. I have circumstantial evidence of the letters. But my employers don't want arrests. They want silence. They want this entire matter to disappear quietly, because prosecuting you means a public trial. A public trial means their secrets become even more public. Newspapers would love this story. Enslaved man destroys 4 wealthy families by exposing their crimes. It makes them look foolish. Worse, it makes them look guilty. So what do they want? They want you gone. Out of New York. Out of the North, preferably. They want you to take your daughter and disappear somewhere they'll never have to think about you again. Do that, and the theft charges disappear. The investigation disappears. You get to live. It was a trap. Had to be a trap. Men like the Ashfords and Kensingtons and Whitmores didn't forgive, didn't forget. And if I refuse, Elijah asked, then I arrest you today. You go to trial for bank theft. You probably hang. Your daughter loses her father right after getting him back. The families still look bad, but at least they get the satisfaction of watching you die. Garrett's expression was unreadable. I'm giving you a choice, Mr. Freeman. It's more than they wanted to give you. I convinced them that killing you would make you a martyr, and they've had enough bad publicity, but the choice is real. Leave or hang. Decide now. Reverend Morris spoke up. You can't expect him to decide in minutes. I can and I am, because if he doesn't decide now, the decision gets made for him. Garrett looked at Elijah. Your daughter arrives tomorrow at noon, Fulton Street dock. Be on a different boat heading west by sunset or be in chains. Your choice. Elijah thought about Sarah, thought about 8 months of planning and destroying and stealing, thought about 42 years of slavery, and the brief bright moment of vengeance that had felt like freedom. Thought about losing it all again because powerful men decided his existence was inconvenient. Where would I go? His voice was quiet. California, Oregon, somewhere far enough that you're not their problem anymore. There are abolition communities out west. Your daughter could have a real life there. Real freedom, not this New York compromise where you're technically free but everyone knows your place. Garrett stood. I'll be at Fulton Street dock tomorrow at sunset. If you're not on a westbound boat by then, I'll have a warrant for your arrest. If you are, we never had this conversation. He left. The church was silent except for the sound of Reverend Morris breathing hard, angry, helpless. Elijah, he's right. Elijah's voice was hollow. About all of it. I did write the letters. I did steal the money. And if I stay, they'll find a way to destroy me. Maybe not through courts, maybe they'll just have someone cut my throat in an alley and call it robbery. Either way, I'm dead if I stay. So you'll run. After everything you did, after proving they could be beaten, you'll just run. I'll survive, Elijah corrected, and I'll make sure Sarah survives. That's all I ever wanted. The rest, he gestured vaguely at the air, at the ruins of 4 families, at the satisfaction he'd thought he'd feel. The rest doesn't matter if she's alive, and I'm dead. That night, Elijah packed what little he owned, spent his last hours in New York walking streets he'd known his entire life, saying goodbye to a city that had never really been his, even when he'd lived here free. He thought about the letters, about Ashford's bankruptcy and Kensington's arrest, and the Whitmores ships impounded in Charleston, about Bergs losing everything, fortune, reputation, freedom. He'd wanted them destroyed. They were destroyed, but Sarah was still traumatized, still recovering from yellow fever and months of brutality in Mississippi, still carrying scars that would never fully heal, and Elijah was still running, still looking over his shoulder, still not truly free despite the legal paperwork that said otherwise. Victory, he realized, looked a lot like defeat when you examined it closely. The steamboat arrived at noon, exactly as Garrett had said it would. Elijah stood on Fulton Street dock with Marcus beside him, watching passengers disembark. Watched for 20 minutes before he saw her. Sarah was so thin he almost didn't recognize her. Thin and bent and moving like someone much older than 16, but alive, walking on her own, looking around with eyes that still held spark despite everything that had tried to extinguish it. She saw him, stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved, separated by 30 feet of dock and 8 months of hell. Then Sarah ran. Not gracefully. She stumbled, nearly fell, caught herself, but she ran anyway, and Elijah met her halfway and held his daughter for the first time since March. She smelled like sickness and steamboat smoke and Mississippi mud. She was shaking, or maybe he was shaking, or maybe they both were. He felt her ribs through her dress, felt how fragile she'd become, and wanted to kill everyone who'd done this to her. But they were already destroyed. He'd seen to that. Papa, her voice was hoarse. Papa, I thought, they told me you were dead. Someone said you'd been hanged for stealing. I'm alive, I'm here. You're safe now. She pulled back to look at him. Her eyes were older than they should have been. Where have you been? What happened to the Bergs? I heard stories on the boat, people talking about banks failing, families ruined. They said Manhattan's elite society collapsed. Was that... Did you... "We need to leave New York," Elijah said instead of answering. "Today. There's a boat west in 6 hours. We have to be on it." "West? But—" "I'll explain everything. But we have to go. Now." Marcus stepped forward, handed Elijah a small canvas bag. "Supplies for the journey. Some money, not much, but enough to get you started. And this." He pulled out a folded document. "Freedom papers. Real ones, legally filed, notarized, for both of you. Cost me favors I'll never get repaid, but they're legitimate. Anyone stops you, you show them these." Elijah took the papers with hands that wanted to shake but didn't. "Marcus, don't thank me. Just go. Get your daughter somewhere safe, somewhere they'll never find you." "And Elijah?" Marcus's expression was serious. "What you did, writing those letters, destroying those families, that's going to echo. People are going to hear about it, and they're going to understand what it means. You might think you lost, but you didn't. You showed them we can fight back. You showed them we're not furniture." Elijah wanted to believe that, wanted to think his destruction of 4 families meant something beyond personal vengeance. But right now, all he cared about was getting Sarah on a boat heading west, before Garrett changed his mind about clemency. They left at 2 o'clock, walked through Manhattan one last time, Sarah leaning on Elijah's arm, both of them moving like refugees fleeing a war zone, which Elijah supposed they were. The westbound boat was called the Pioneer, ironic name for people running from the past rather than seeking a new future. But it was headed to Ohio, then Indiana, then possibly all the way to California if passengers wanted to continue. Elijah bought 2 tickets with money Marcus had given him, found a spot on the crowded deck where they could sit with their backs against a wall. Sarah fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from months of sickness and the shock of freedom. Elijah stayed awake, watched the dock, watched for Garrett, for police, for anyone who might have decided a deal was no deal at all. At sunset, the boat's horn sounded. Ropes were untied. The Pioneer pulled away from Fulton Street dock and into the Hudson River, heading north and west. Elijah watched New York disappear behind them, watched the city that had held him captive for 42 years shrink to a smudge on the horizon, then to nothing. He'd destroyed 4 families. He'd saved his daughter. He'd committed crimes that should have gotten him hanged. And now he was free in a way that didn't feel like freedom at all, just running with better paperwork. Sarah woke as the sun was setting, turning the Hudson orange and gold. She looked around, disoriented, then remembered where they were. "Papa," her voice was small, "tell me what happened, please. I need to understand what you did." So Elijah told her. All of it. The letters, the secrets he'd collected over decades of invisible service, the theft from Continental Bank, the systematic destruction of the Ashfords, Kensingtons, Whitmores, and Bergs. Every calculated step, every carefully lit fire. Sarah listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "You did that for me?" she finally asked. "I did it because I had nothing left to lose except you. But you destroyed them. You actually destroyed them." She sounded awed and horrified simultaneously. Those families were Manhattan royalty. Everyone said they were untouchable. Nobody's untouchable. They just want you to think they are. Sarah leaned against his shoulder. "What happens now?" "Now we go west. We find somewhere small, somewhere quiet. We build a new life. Will they come after us?" "I don't know," Elijah admitted. "Probably. Eventually. Men like that don't forgive." "Then, why not keep fighting? Why run if they'll just hunt us anyway?" It was a fair question. Elijah had asked himself the same thing 100 times in the past day. "Because I'm tired," he said finally. "Because you need to heal, not watch your father die in a New York prison. Because sometimes survival is the only victory that matters." Sarah was quiet again. Then, "I heard what happened in Mississippi, to the other enslaved people on that plantation. After I left, what happened? They rebelled, killed the overseer and 2 others, burned the main house. Most of them were captured and hanged, but 3 escaped. People said it was because of you, because of what you'd done in New York. Said word had spread that someone fought back and won. Said it gave them courage." Elijah felt something in his chest tighten. "I didn't win, Sarah. I ran. You survived. Maybe that's the same thing." The Pioneer traveled for 3 weeks, up the Hudson, through canals, across Lake Erie. They stopped in small towns where Elijah and Sarah would disembark for supplies, always watching for threats that never materialized. In Cleveland, they heard news from New York. Archibald Ashford had committed suicide, unable to face bankruptcy and public humiliation. Jonathan Kensington was in federal prison, sentenced to 5 years for tax evasion. The Whitmores had fled to England to avoid prosecution. And Berg, Master Berg, who'd called himself generous, had lost everything in the divorce and was living in a boarding house in Brooklyn, bitter and broken. 4 families, 4 empires, all reduced to rubble by letters written in a church basement by a man they'd considered property. Sarah listened to the news without expression. "Do you feel satisfied?" she asked. "No," Elijah admitted. "I thought I would. Thought their destruction would feel like justice. But mostly I just feel tired." They continued west, through Indiana, where abolition communities welcomed them, but where slave catchers still prowled. Through Illinois, where the law was supposedly on their side, but where prejudice made every day dangerous. In a small town outside Chicago, they met a family named Johnson, freed people who'd been west for 5 years, who owned a small farm and seemed genuinely happy. The Johnsons told them about communities in Wisconsin, about land that could be bought cheap, about places where black families could build actual lives. "Is it real?" Sarah asked Mrs. Johnson over dinner. "Real freedom, I mean. Not just papers saying you're free while everyone treats you like property anyway." Mrs. Johnson smiled sadly. "Honey, I won't lie to you. Prejudice exists everywhere. Violence exists everywhere. But out here, at least the law is mostly on our side. And there's enough space that you can build something without someone trying to tear it down every 5 minutes just because they don't think you deserve it." That night, Elijah sat outside the Johnsons' farmhouse and thought about what Mrs. Johnson had said. Thought about Manhattan, about the Berg townhouse, about 42 years of building nothing because anything he built could be taken. Maybe that was the real victory. Not destroying his enemies, but finally having space to build something they couldn't reach. They settled in Wisconsin in March of 1852, exactly 1 year after Sarah had been taken to Charleston. Bought a small piece of land outside Milwaukee, with money Marcus had scraped together and sent west. Built a cabin that leaked when it rained and was drafty in winter, but was theirs in a way nothing had ever been theirs before. Sarah healed slowly. The yellow fever damage lingered. She tired easily, got sick at the smallest provocation, but she learned to read fluently, taught by Elijah using books borrowed from Abolition Society libraries, started writing her own letters, not to destroy families, but to document her experiences. She wanted people to know what had happened, wanted the truth recorded. Elijah found work as a bookkeeper for a freight company. His mathematical skills, honed through decades of counting other people's wealth, translated well to legitimate employment. The pay was modest, but it was his pay, earned through his labor, with no debt attached. Life was quiet, almost boring. After the chaos of New York, after the calculated destruction and the desperate theft and the running, Wisconsin felt like exhaling after holding his breath for 42 years. But the past wasn't finished with them yet. The letter arrived in June, delivered by a traveling postman who serviced the rural routes. It was addressed to Elijah Freeman, care of Milwaukee Freight Company, which meant someone had worked hard to find him. Inside, 2 sheets of paper. The first was a newspaper clipping from the New York Herald, dated April 1852, Truth Behind the Manhattan Collapse. Investigation reveals anonymous letters that destroyed 4 prominent families were written by former Berg servant Elijah Freeman, 42, now fugitive from bank theft charges. Freeman, who spent 37 years in bondage to the Berg family, systematically exposed corruption, adultery, tax evasion, and illegal slave trading before fleeing New York with his daughter. Though crimes were committed, sources note all information in Freeman's letters was factually accurate. Federal authorities continue search, though Freeman is believed to have fled west. The second sheet was handwritten. "Mr. Freeman, you should know that your actions have inspired others. Since your letters became public knowledge, 3 more families in New York have been exposed by their own servants. Enslaved people in Maryland organized a rebellion citing your example. Abolition societies are using your story to show that the powerful can be challenged. You probably think you failed because you had to run. You didn't fail. You showed us how to fight. The bank theft charges have been quietly dropped. Turns out the families didn't want a trial after all. You're no longer a fugitive. You're free to return if you wish, though I wouldn't recommend it. Stay safe. Finish what you started by living well. A friend. No signature. No return address. But the handwriting looked familiar. Elijah thought it might be Marcus or possibly Reverend Morris, someone who wanted him to know he'd mattered. Sarah read the letter over his shoulder. They dropped the charges. You could go back? Why would I go back? Elijah looked around their small cabin, at the land they were slowly cultivating, at the life they were carefully building. Everything I wanted is here. But New York took 42 years of my life and gave me nothing but rage and trauma in return. I'm not going back to that. Sarah nodded slowly, then quietly. The letter says you inspired people. Rebellions, exposures, that's something, isn't it? Maybe. Elijah folded the newspaper clipping carefully. Or maybe I just proved you could hurt them without dying immediately. Not sure that's inspiration or just desperation. Does it matter? If the result is the same? It was a good question. Elijah didn't have an answer. Over the following months, more stories filtered west. Stories about servants suddenly refusing to be silent, about enslaved people finding courage to resist, about the Underground Railroad operating more openly because people believed fighting back was possible now. Some of those stories were probably exaggerated, some were probably false, but some were real, and that mattered. In September, a young man showed up at their cabin. He was maybe 20 with the careful movements of someone who'd run far and fast. He introduced himself as Thomas, said he'd escaped from Kentucky, said he'd heard about Elijah Freeman, and wanted to meet the man who'd destroyed 4 families with nothing but words. I worked in a house like you did, Thomas explained over dinner. Listened to everything, memorized everything. Always thought it was useless information, just things I knew that didn't matter. But then I heard about you, about what you did, and I realized information is power, even for people who have nothing else. What did you do with it? Sarah asked. Thomas smiled grimly. Wrote letters just like Mr. Freeman, sent them to newspapers, to federal marshals, to business partners, exposed my master for fraud, for abuse, for everything he'd done. He's in prison now. His business is ruined. And you? Elijah asked. I ran, obviously, but I hurt him first. That's something. Thomas looked at Elijah with an expression of reverence that made him deeply uncomfortable. You showed us how. You proved it could be done. After Thomas left, continuing his journey further west, Sarah turned to Elijah. You're a symbol now, whether you want to be or not. I'm a man who stole money from a bank and ran away, Elijah replied. That's not symbolic. That's just crime and cowardice. You're a man who fought back when everyone said it was impossible, who saved his daughter and destroyed his enemies. That's not cowardice. That's revolution. Elijah didn't believe her, but over the next year, more people came. More stories circulated. More letters appeared in newspapers, written by anonymous servants who'd learned to use information as a weapon. The pattern Elijah had started, careful observation, methodical documentation, strategic exposure, spread like fire through dry grass. Not everyone succeeded. Many were caught, punished, killed. But enough succeeded that the powerful started looking over their shoulders, started wondering if their servants were listening, started realizing that invisible people had been watching all along. By 1853, what the newspapers had started calling the Freeman method was being discussed in abolition circles as a viable form of resistance. Not violent rebellion, which often ended in mass death, but tactical exposure, using the master's own crimes against them, turning their arrogance into vulnerability. Elijah read about it in newspapers and felt a mixture of pride and horror. Pride that his desperate acts had meant something. Horror at the implications, at how many people might die trying to replicate his success, at how easily his story of survival was being romanticized into heroic myth. I didn't do it to start a movement, he told Sarah when another article appeared, this one calling him the architect of resistance through revelation. I did it because I was angry and desperate and I had no other options. Maybe that's what movements are, Sarah replied. Desperate people discovering options nobody thought existed. In 1854, Sarah married a freedman named Michael who worked in Milwaukee. In 1855, she had a daughter, Elijah's granddaughter, named Constance. The baby was born free, legally and actually free, the first person in 3 generations of their family who didn't have to buy their own humanity. Elijah held his granddaughter and thought about the Bergs, about the Ashfords and Kensingtons and Whitmores. Thought about 4 families destroyed, so this one small person could exist in freedom. Was it worth it? He still didn't know. In 1859, a man named John Brown attempted an armed rebellion at Harper's Ferry. It failed spectacularly, ended with Brown executed, and his followers dead or scattered. But Brown had kept a journal, and in it he'd written about tactics of resistance, about using information, about exposing hypocrisy, about the Freeman method of systematic revelation. Elijah read about it and felt sick. His method wasn't supposed to get people killed. It was supposed to be the alternative to violence, but maybe there were no clean alternatives. Maybe every form of resistance carried body counts, and the only choice was how many and whose. The Civil War started in 1861. Elijah was 56 years old, too old to fight, but he contributed what he could. Money to freedom societies, shelter to escaped enslaved people moving north, information to Union officers about supply routes he remembered from his years serving Manhattan elite, who'd had business interests across the South. Sarah's husband Michael enlisted, survived 3 battles before dying at Antietam in 1862. Sarah mourned and kept living, because that's what they did. They mourned and kept living because giving up wasn't an option. In 1863, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Slavery was over, legally, if not practically. Elijah read the document and felt hollow. 43 years of bondage had shaped him into someone who couldn't fully trust freedom, even when it was written into federal law. But his granddaughter Constance, now 8 years old, read it with hope. And maybe that was enough. Maybe his generation couldn't believe, but maybe the next could. The war ended in 1865. Elijah was 60 years old, gray-haired and tired but alive. Sarah was 33, a widow raising a daughter alone but managing. Constance was 10, bright and fierce and completely unaware that the life she lived had been impossible for her grandfather at her age. They'd survived. Against odds that should have crushed them, they'd survived. In 1867, a journalist from Chicago came to interview Elijah. The journalist was writing a book about resistance during slavery, wanted to document the Freeman method from the source. Elijah agreed to talk. Not because he wanted fame, he'd spent most of his life trying to be invisible, but because Sarah convinced him the story needed to be told. What you did mattered, she insisted. Not just destroying those families, but showing others they could fight back. People need to know that. So Elijah told the journalist everything. About the Bergs and the 42 years of bondage, about Sarah being sold, about the letters and the theft and the calculated destruction of 4 families, about running to Wisconsin and building a life from ash. Do you regret it? The journalist asked. Destroying those families? Elijah thought about that question for a long time. I regret that it was necessary, he finally said. I regret living in a world where the only way to save my daughter was to become the thing they feared most. An uppity Negro who refused to know his place. I regret that mercy wasn't an option, that they gave me no choice but destruction or submission. But do I regret what I actually did? No. They earned everything that happened to them. Some people call you a hero. I'm not a hero. Heroes don't steal from banks. Heroes don't ruin people out of rage. Elijah looked out the window at the small farm he'd built. I'm just a father who loved his daughter more than he feared death. That's not heroism. That's just being human. The journalist's book was published in 1868, Voices of Resistance, How Enslaved Americans Fought Back. Elijah's chapter was titled, The Man Who Burned 4 Houses with Paper and Ink. The book sold well. Elijah's story became part of the historical record. People wrote letters thanking him for inspiring them, wrote letters asking for advice on their own resistance efforts, wrote letters treating him like some kind of prophet. He ignored most of them. He wasn't a prophet, he was just tired. In 1872, Elijah received an unexpected letter from New York. It was from Theodore Vanderberg, Master Vanderberg's eldest son, who'd been 18 when Elijah destroyed his family 20 years earlier. The letter was short. Mr. Freeman, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that my father died last week. Died bitter and alone in a boarding house, still convinced he'd done nothing wrong. I was 18 when you destroyed our family. I'm 38 now. Spent 20 years thinking about what happened, about what we did to you and your daughter, about how we justified it. I can't undo the past, but I've spent the last 10 years working with abolition societies, with freedmen's aid organizations. trying to make amends for sins I was complicit in even if I was too young to fully understand them. I don't know if that matters to you. Probably doesn't. But I wanted you to know that what you did, it didn't just destroy my family. It woke some of us up. Theodore van der Berg. Elijah read the letter 3 times, then filed it away with the rest of his correspondence. He didn't respond. Didn't know what he'd say if he did. Forgiveness wasn't something he had in surplus these days. Sarah saw the letter, read it over his shoulder. Will you write back? Why would I? Because he's trying. That's something, isn't it? His trying doesn't undo 42 years of my life being stolen. Doesn't undo what they did to you. No, Sarah agreed. But maybe it prevents them doing it to someone else. Maybe that's all we can ask for. Not that they undo the past, but that they don't repeat it. Elijah thought about that. About Theodore van der Berg, who'd been a privileged teenager when this started, and was now a middle-aged man trying to atone for his family's sins. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe preventing future harm was the best revenge, better than destruction, which only created temporary satisfaction and permanent absence. He wrote back, 1 sentence. I hope you succeed where your father failed. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement that change was possible, even for people born into systems designed to make them monsters. In 1877, Elijah fell ill. Nothing dramatic, just old age catching up, joints that ached, lungs that wheezed, a body that had endured too much for too long, finally starting to surrender. Sarah took care of him, the way he'd once taken care of her. Constance, now 22, visited regularly with her own young children. Elijah's great-grandchildren, another generation born into freedom. Tell them the story, Sarah urged during one visit. About New York, about the letters, they should know. Why? It's over. The war's over. Slavery's over. Why dwell on old pain? Because forgetting is how it happens again, Sarah said quietly. Because these children need to know that resistance is possible, that their great-grandfather wasn't just a victim, he was someone who fought back and won. I didn't win, I ran away. You survived. You saved me. You inspired others. That's winning, Papa. So Elijah told his great-grandchildren the story, simplified it, left out the worst parts, but told them the core truth, that their great-grandfather had been enslaved, had fought back, had used information as a weapon when he had no other weapons. The children listened with wide eyes, asked questions about New York, about the families, about whether he'd been scared. Yes, Elijah admitted. I was terrified every moment. But I did it anyway because fear doesn't make things wrong. It just makes them hard. In 1889, Elijah died peacefully in his sleep. He was 84 years old, had lived 51 years as property, and 33 years free. Outlived all 4 families he'd destroyed, outlived slavery itself. His funeral was attended by hundreds, freedmen from across Wisconsin, activists from abolition societies, former enslaved people who credited his example with giving them courage, historians documenting the resistance movement. Theodore van der Berg sent flowers with a note, "Thank you for teaching us we could change." Sarah delivered the eulogy. She talked about her father not as a symbol or a hero, but as a man who'd been broken and rebuilt himself, a man who'd loved fiercely enough to commit crimes, a man who'd survived by being smarter than people who thought they were untouchable. My father wasn't perfect, Sarah said. He stole. He destroyed. He was driven by rage and desperation, but he was also brilliant and patient and loved me enough to burn the world down. And maybe that's what heroism looks like when you're not allowed to be a conventional hero. Maybe it's just loving someone enough to fight for them, even when fighting means becoming the villain in someone else's story. After the funeral, the family gathered at the small farmhouse Elijah had built 40 years earlier. They ate, they told stories, they mourned. Constance, now 34, found a box in her grandfather's room. Inside were papers, letters he'd saved, newspaper clippings documenting the destruction of the 4 families, his own handwritten notes about what he'd learned. At the bottom of the box was an envelope addressed to whoever finds this. Inside, a single sheet of paper covered in Elijah's careful handwriting. I didn't write this story to justify what I did. I wrote it so people would understand what forces someone to do such things. I wrote it because the newspapers call me a hero, and I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who was given impossible choices and made the only ones I could live with. I destroyed 4 families, that's fact. But those families destroyed thousands of lives over generations. That's also fact. I don't know if one justifies the other. I just know I'd do it all again if it meant saving Sarah. Maybe that makes me a monster. Maybe it makes me human. Maybe those are the same thing when the world forces you to choose between morality and survival. I survived. Sarah survived. Our descendants will survive. We won by outliving them. That's all I ever wanted. Elijah Freeman, 1889. The legacy of Elijah Freeman didn't end with his death. It grew, complicated and controversial, into something he never intended and probably wouldn't have recognized. In 1923, 34 years after Elijah died, his great-great-granddaughter Rebecca was going through family archives when she found the box Constance had discovered. Along with Elijah's papers were additional documents Sarah had kept, copies of the letters Elijah had written, detailed notes about the destruction of each family, correspondence from people who'd been inspired by his methods. Rebecca was 28, educated at a Negro college in Atlanta, working as a teacher in Milwaukee. She recognized immediately what she'd found: primary source documentation of one of the most effective acts of individual resistance during American slavery. She contacted historians, contacted civil rights organizations, contacted newspapers that were documenting Black history in ways that hadn't been possible during Elijah's lifetime. The response was immediate and divided. Some historians celebrated the discovery, called Elijah Freeman the intellectual architect of informational warfare, compared his methods to modern investigative journalism, argued that his careful documentation and strategic exposure of corruption represented sophisticated resistance that deserved recognition alongside more violent rebellions. Others were uncomfortable, pointed out that Elijah had committed crimes: theft, extortion through threat of exposure, destruction of property through orchestrated financial collapse, asked whether celebrating him normalized criminal behavior, worried that making him a hero meant endorsing revenge over justice. The debate raged through academic circles, Black churches, civil rights organizations. Was Elijah Freeman a hero or a criminal? A freedom fighter? Or a vengeful man who'd rationalized his crimes through the lens of oppression? Rebecca found herself at the center of these debates, defending her great-great-grandfather to people who'd never been enslaved, who'd never faced impossible choices, who had the luxury of moral certainty from a century's distance. "You call him a criminal," she said, during one particularly heated discussion at a historical society meeting in 1924. But what were his alternatives? Ask nicely for his daughter back? Trust the law that had declared him property for 42 years? Wait patiently while she died in Mississippi? Tell me, what would you have done differently if someone sold your child? The room went silent, because nobody had an answer. Nobody wanted to admit that they might have done exactly what Elijah did, or worse. In 1925, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People invited Rebecca to speak at their annual conference. She stood before hundreds of activists and historians and told them her great-great-grandfather's story. Not the sanitized version, not the heroic myth, the real story, complete with theft and rage and moral ambiguity. Elijah Freeman was not a saint, she concluded. He was a human being pushed to the edge by a system designed to dehumanize him. He fought back with the only weapons available: information and calculated destruction. He wasn't fighting for abstract justice or historical legacy. He was fighting to save his daughter. Everything else was consequence. The speech was published in The Crisis, the NAACP's magazine. It sparked renewed interest in Elijah's story, inspired research into other cases of enslaved people using information as resistance, led to a broader understanding that rebellion came in many forms, not just the dramatic violence of Nat Turner's rebellion or John Brown's raid, but also the quiet, methodical exposure of the powerful by people they considered invisible. In 1927, a white historian named Dr. Edward Thornton published a controversial paper titled The Freeman Methodology: Information Warfare in American Slavery. Thornton had spent 3 years researching Elijah's letters, tracking down descendants of the 4 destroyed families, examining court records and newspaper archives. His conclusion was uncomfortable for everyone. Elijah Freeman had been absolutely methodical in his destruction, had calculated every move with precision that suggested not rage, but cold, strategic planning. The letters weren't emotional outbursts. They were surgical strikes designed to create maximum chaos with minimum exposure. Freeman operated like a modern intelligence agent, Thornton wrote. He gathered information for years, catalogued it mentally, then deployed it strategically when needed. This wasn't reactive violence born of desperation. This was calculated warfare waged by someone who understood that information about the powerful was more dangerous than weapons. The paper was both praised and condemned. Praised for recognizing the intelligence and strategic thinking of an enslaved man, something white historians rarely acknowledged. Condemned for making Elijah sound cold and calculating rather than sympathetically desperate. Rebecca read the paper and wrote to Dr. Thornton. He was both, desperate and calculating. Those aren't contradictions, they're survival. Thornton published her response in his next paper. Through the 1930s and 40s, Elijah's story became part of black historical consciousness. Not widely known in white America, they had their own preferred narratives of slavery and resistance, but passed down in black communities as proof that fighting back was possible, even in the most oppressive circumstances. During World War II, the story took on new significance. Black soldiers fighting fascism overseas while facing segregation at home drew parallels between Elijah's resistance and their own struggle. If one man with nothing but information could destroy 4 powerful families, what could an organized community accomplish? The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s found inspiration in Elijah's methodology. Not the theft or destruction, those were products of his era, but the core strategy. Use the enemy's own crimes against them. Document everything. Expose hypocrisy. Force confrontation not through violence but through undeniable truth. Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, the student sit-ins, the Freedom Riders. These were different tactics, but they shared Elijah's understanding. Power came not just from direct confrontation, but from making injustice so visible it couldn't be ignored. In 1968, during the chaos following Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, riots erupted in cities across America. In Milwaukee, where Elijah had lived and died, protesters marched past the small museum that had been established in his honor. Someone painted on its wall, "Elijah knew, they burn, we build." The graffiti stayed for months. Museum curators debated whether to remove it, finally decided to leave it as a reminder that Elijah's legacy was complicated. He'd burned and built simultaneously, and people would always argue about which mattered more. Rebecca died in 1970, having spent 47 years as the primary keeper of her great-great-grandfather's story. Before she died, she donated all of Elijah's papers to the Wisconsin Historical Society with one condition: they must be made available to everyone, not just academics. "This story belongs to people who need hope," she wrote in her will, "not just people who need footnotes." Through the 1970s and 80s, Elijah's story appeared in textbooks, usually as a footnote. Elijah Freeman, 1805-1889. Enslaved man who exposed corruption of 4 New York families, 1847-1852. Brief, sanitized, stripped of complexity. But in black history courses, in churches, in community centers, the full story persisted. The rage, the desperation, the theft, the brilliant strategy, the moral ambiguity, all of it. Because sanitized heroes were useless. Real people needed real examples of how to fight back when fighting back seemed impossible. In 1995, a black playwright named Marcus Johnson wrote a play called The Letters of Elijah Freeman. It premiered in Chicago, ran for 6 weeks, then toured to Milwaukee, Detroit, New York. The play didn't shy away from the darkness. It showed Elijah's rage, showed the theft, showed the cold calculation behind each letter. Critics were divided. Some praised its honesty. Others argued it made a hero out of a criminal. One review in the Chicago Tribune summed up the controversy. Johnson's Elijah is neither hero nor villain, but something more uncomfortable. A human being forced to choose between morality and survival, who chose survival and lived with the consequences. The play ran for 3 years, inspired conversations about resistance, about the ethics of fighting oppression, about how history judges people who break laws to survive. In 2000, historians discovered additional letters in a Baltimore archive, responses to Elijah's anonymous letters from some of the families he'd destroyed. The letters revealed something Elijah never knew. Several of the families had suspected each other of writing the anonymous letters. The Bergs thought the Ashfords had exposed them. The Kensingtons thought the Whitmores had turned on them. The paranoia and mutual suspicion had amplified the destruction beyond what Elijah alone had caused. He didn't just destroy them with information, one historian noted. He destroyed them with their own capacity for betrayal. He understood that people who built empires on exploitation would naturally assume everyone else operated the same way. He weaponized their worldview against them. In 2008, a descendant of the Ashford family, a woman named Catherine Ashford Morrison, published a memoir called Legacy of Lies, Growing Up in the Shadow of Family Shame. In it, she traced how her family's destruction by Elijah Freeman had echoed through 5 generations, her great-great-grandfather's bankruptcy and suicide, the family's fall from wealth to poverty, the shame and anger passed down like genetic inheritance. But she ended the memoir with something unexpected. My family taught me to hate Elijah Freeman, taught me he was the villain who destroyed us out of spite and vengeance. But the older I got, the more I read the actual history, the more I realized he only exposed what was already true. My great-great-grandfather did have a second family, did commit fraud, did build wealth through exploitation. Elijah Freeman didn't destroy my family. My family destroyed themselves, and Freeman just made sure everyone knew about it. I wish I could tell him I understand now. I wish I could tell him I'm sorry. The memoir sparked a small controversy. Some Ashford descendants disowned Catherine for betraying the family. Others quietly reached out to support her. One sent her a letter. "You're the first person in 5 generations brave enough to tell the truth. Thank you." In 2015, a historian at Columbia University named Dr. Patricia Williams published the definitive scholarly work on Elijah Freeman, Invisible Warfare: How Elijah Freeman Weaponized Information Against American Slavery. The book was 600 pages, meticulously researched, drawing on newly discovered documents and interviews with descendants of all the families involved. Williams's thesis was that Elijah represented a largely undocumented form of resistance, intellectual and strategic rather than physical. She argued that history had overlooked these forms of resistance because they didn't fit neat narratives of either noble suffering or violent rebellion. Elijah Freeman was neither a pacifist saint nor a violent revolutionary, she wrote. He was something more complex and more threatening to the established order. He was smart, patient, and willing to use the system's own mechanisms against it. That terrified people then, and it makes them uncomfortable now because it suggests that oppressed people aren't just victims or rebels, they're strategic actors capable of sophisticated warfare. The book won several awards, sparked renewed academic interest in Elijah's story, led to symposiums, dissertations, debates about the nature of resistance and the ethics of revenge. But perhaps the most significant moment came in 2018, when Elijah's great-great-great-great-grandson, a man named Michael Freeman Harris, was invited to speak at a reunion of descendants from all 5 families: Elijah's descendants and descendants of the Bergs, Ashfords, Kensingtons, and Whitmores. The event was organized by a reconciliation organization that specialized in bringing together families divided by historical trauma. It was held in Manhattan, not far from where the original Berg townhouse had stood. Michael was nervous. "What do I say to people whose families my great-great-great-great-grandfather destroyed?" he asked his wife the night before. "The truth," she replied. "That's what Elijah would do." The meeting was awkward at first. 40 people in a conference room divided by history they'd inherited but not created. Descendants of the enslaved meeting descendants of enslavers. Descendants of the destroyer meeting descendants of the destroyed. Michael stood up first. "My name is Michael Freeman Harris. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was Elijah Freeman. He destroyed your family's wealth and reputations in 1847, 1852. I can't apologize for what he did, because I understand why he did it. But I can acknowledge that his actions caused pain that echoed through generations. Your families suffered because of his choices. That's true even if those choices were survival." There was silence. Then a woman stood up. Helen Vanderberg Mitchell, 67 years old, direct descendant of Master Vanderberg. "My family enslaved yours for 42 years, she said quietly. "We sold his daughter. We treated him as property. Everything he did to us, we earned. I've spent my life learning that, accepting it, trying to understand what it means to be descended from people who did terrible things. I don't blame Elijah Freeman. I blame my ancestors for creating a situation where his choices would destroy us or watch his daughter die." Another woman stood. Paula Kensington Ross, descendant of the textile family. My great-great-great-grandfather evaded taxes and let workers die to protect his profits. Elijah Freeman exposed that. My family taught me to hate him for it, but he didn't lie. Everything he exposed was true. Maybe the real legacy isn't that he destroyed our families, but that our families deserve to be destroyed. The conversation lasted 4 hours. People cried, people argued, people shared stories passed down through generations, stories of wealth lost, of shame carried, of anger and regret and slowly dawning understanding. At the end, they decided to create a joint memorial, not a statue, those were too divisive, but a scholarship fund. The Freeman Van der Berg Ashford Kensington Whitmore Educational Fund, providing money for descendants of enslaved people to attend college. "We can't undo the past," Helen Van der Berg Mitchell said during the press conference announcing the fund. "But we can acknowledge what happened and try to build something better from the rubble." That's what Elijah did. Built a life from rubble. We're just following his example. The story made national news. Some praised the reconciliation. Others criticized it as both sidesing slavery. The debate raged online, in newspapers, in academic journals, but the scholarship fund launched anyway. Raised $2 million in the first year, sent 37 students to college. One of those students was Elijah's great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter, a young woman named Sarah Freeman Watson, named after her ancestor who'd survived Mississippi and yellow fever and the sale that started everything. Sarah Freeman Watson studied history at Columbia University, wrote her senior thesis on her ancestor, Elijah Freeman, and the ethics of survival, when morality becomes a luxury. In the thesis, she argued that judging Elijah by modern moral standards missed the point. "We have the privilege of debating his methods because we're not enslaved," she wrote. "We can afford moral purity because we're not watching our children die 800 miles away." Elijah couldn't afford that luxury. He did what he had to do to survive and save his daughter. Everything else is commentary from people who've never faced his choices. The thesis went viral online, sparked arguments on social media, led to Sarah being invited to speak at universities, at civil rights organizations, at conferences about historical trauma and reconciliation. During one speech at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2024, Sarah said something that captured the essential truth about her ancestor. "People ask me if Elijah Freeman was a hero or a criminal. Was he justified, or did he go too far? Did he fight for justice or just revenge? And my answer is yes, all of it. He was hero and criminal, justified and excessive, justice seeker and revenge taker. He was a human being pushed beyond human limits who responded with brilliant strategy and terrible rage. He was flawed and fierce, and he survived. That's the only legacy that matters. He survived when the system was designed to crush him. And because he survived, I'm here." That's what resistance looks like when you strip away the mythology. It's messy and complicated and morally ambiguous, and it's necessary. The speech ended with thunderous applause from some audience members and stony silence from others, because Elijah's legacy remained what it had always been: divisive, complicated, impossible to reduce to simple lessons. In 2025, 173 years after Elijah destroyed 4 families with letters and information, a small museum opened in Milwaukee dedicated to his life. The museum didn't call him a hero, didn't call him a villain. The plaque at the entrance simply read, "Elijah Freeman, 1805-1889, enslaved for 42 years, free for 33. Father, strategist, survivor. He fought back with the only weapons available: truth, patience, and the understanding that powerful people reveal their secrets to those they consider invisible. His methods were controversial. His survival was absolute." Inside the museum, visitors could read his original letters, see the newspaper clippings documenting the destruction of the 4 families, read testimony from descendants on all sides, watch video interviews with historians debating his legacy. But the centerpiece of the museum was the letter Elijah had written late in his life, found in the box after his death, the one that ended, "I survived. Sarah survived. Our descendants will survive. We won by outliving them." Next to that letter was a photo taken in 2024. 7 generations of Elijah's descendants, ranging from his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson, age 3, to his great-great-granddaughter Rebecca's daughter, age 94. 42 people total, spanning 173 years. 42 people who existed because one man had loved his daughter enough to burn the world down. The museum's final room was interactive. Visitors were invited to write their own reflections on a question displayed on the wall. What would you do to save someone you love? How far would you go? What lines would you cross? Be honest. Thousands of people had written responses. The answers varied wildly. I'd do exactly what Elijah did. I'd like to think I'd find a better way, but I probably wouldn't. I can't judge him because I've never been that desperate. He was wrong, but I understand why. He was right, and anyone who says otherwise has never truly loved someone. It's not about right or wrong. It's about survival. The museum didn't provide a definitive answer to whether Elijah Freeman was hero or villain, whether his actions were justified or excessive, whether history should celebrate or condemn him, because there was no definitive answer. There never had been. Elijah Freeman was a man who'd been enslaved for 42 years, who'd watched his daughter sold like livestock, who'd realized the system was designed to destroy him and everyone he loved. He'd fought back with brilliant strategy and cold rage. He'd committed crimes. He'd exposed truths. He'd destroyed families who'd built empires on human suffering. He'd saved his daughter. He'd run away. He'd survived. And 173 years later, his descendants numbered in the hundreds. They were teachers, doctors, lawyers, artists, activists. They were people who existed because their ancestor had refused to be destroyed. That was Elijah Freeman's legacy, not moral perfection, not unambiguous heroism, but absolute survival against a system designed to ensure his extinction. He'd been invisible for 42 years, furniture that rich people talked over and threw and around. But invisible people see everything, and sometimes what they see is enough to burn the world down. Elijah Freeman had been worth nothing according to the ledger books, depreciated to zero value, maintained only through debt obligation. But his descendants would tell you differently, would tell you he was worth everything, worth the controversy, worth the moral ambiguity, worth the complicated legacy that couldn't be reduced to simple lessons. He'd survived. That was the only metric that mattered, and in surviving, he'd won.